Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. And I'm pleased to be joined by Joshua Frank, who is the author of, let's put this on the screen, Atomic Days, the untold story of the most toxic place in America. This is out from Haymarket Books. It's available. You can go there and find it. But obviously, there's other local bookstores that you could probably get the book from as well. Let me take that down for just a moment. And so, welcome, Josh. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And so, we're going to get into what you mean by this most toxic place in America. But I figure let's use your own words to set this up and get us oriented. There's a lot. This is a sprawling topic, and the book is over 200 pages. And we're obviously not going to try to get to all of it. And even in a rich conversation for an hour, we're going to be barely scratching the surface on many of the issues that are experienced for the Pacific Northwest region as a result of this nuclear waste site. But let me get to your what I thought was a very good summation of the problem. It comes in the chapter where you detail how this is all part of the permanent disaster economy. So I realize right now there are people who are listening who may be going, "What's the Hanford nuclear site?" You can't get going without explaining what that is, but just be patient with me and just let's start with this, which is if you only needed to know two things about what Hanford is today, this is what you write. They would be these. First, it's the most expensive environmental cleanup in world history. The latter is the result of a free market approach to the cleanup. The former is a byproduct of the Cold War and the United States' addiction to the deadly weapons industry. In every aspect, Hanford is a quintessential U.S. project. It's tough, it's dangerous, it's built on stolen lands. It's also vitally important to understand that the issues plaguing Hanford are not solely the result of a few bad apples. The various problems are not the result of bad science or a lack of know-how among staff at the Department of Energy. Instead, the troubles engulfing this corner of Washington state are wholly systemic in nature, entombed in a profit-driven model that more often than not creates as many fiascos as it solves. In other words, Hanford is a solid case proving that capitalism and an almost religious devotion to private industry contracts is not the best remedy to environmental disasters. And to close that out, Hanford's calamity was also exacerbated by the Cold War's inter-imperial rivalry between the Soviets and the U.S., a dynamic that is playing out in a similar fashion between the U.S. and China today. This is a very good setup. There are many, many issues there, but why don't you, just begin by saying what the Hanford nuclear site is when we're talking about this, the location and what it did, what it was
Mhm.
designed to do, but does not do anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think first to understand where it is regionally, it's located in eastern Washington state, near the Tri-Cities area, for those that are familiar with that zone. It's along the Columbia River. The site was chosen during the Manhattan Project to produce plutonium. And there were other sites that were obviously chosen as well, Oak Ridge being another one that's pretty popular. People know about it. But Hanford, in large extent, was chosen because it was kind of out of sight, out of mind. It was in an area that wasn't heavily populated. It wasn't close to any major cities. And also, since it was a nuclear operation, they needed access to consistent electricity, which was provided by the dams that are along the Columbia River. And then also it needed a lot of land. It's about 4 times the landmass of Lake Tahoe, which is about half the size of Rhode Island. It's a massive, sprawling area and region. And the people that lived there originally were easy to remove. There were indigenous populations, the Nez Perce and the Yakima. They were eviscerated from the region, as well as some small farmers were moved off the land to erect this atomic beast. And then it became the go-to place for plutonium during the Cold War. It produced over 21,000 nuclear warheads, or fuel for nuclear warheads. And before that, it produced the Fat Man bomb, the fuel for the Fat Man bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. So it's been, since its inception, an integral part of U.S. imperialism at home. Richland, which is the city closest to Hanford, was a military town in large extent. It was full of scientists, and still is to today. Back then, they were producing weapons and producing fuel for weapons. Today, they're there working on figuring out how to clean up this big mess. During the operation of Hanford, which was over about close to 4 decades, it produced an enormous amount of waste. There were a million gallons of waste that was leaking out of these huge underground tanks. They produced, I think there's 149 single shell tanks that are there now. Those tanks were filled with nuclear waste in sort of this cascading event that spilled over. And to this day, they have a huge problem with it, which we can get into. There are 28 double shelled tanks. They figured out, oh, these single shell tanks aren't going to hold all this waste from producing nuclear, or from producing plutonium. So we better put it into these other double shell tanks. And even back then, the scientists that were creating and making this stuff knew that these tanks weren't going to last for very long. I mean, they were supposed to last about 2 decades, and now we're going on, almost 8 decades, 80 years. So they're 60 years past their lifespan. And it's creating a huge amount of problem. There's been 67 official known leaks that they know about over the course of their life. Right now, 2 of those tanks are leaking, and they don't really have an answer for it. It's a huge, huge mess. And to top it off, as you read from that excerpt, it's very profitable. They're looking at $170 billion have been spent so far on this cleanup. Not much progress has been made. Estimates just keep going up and up and up. 6 years ago, the estimate was going to be about $200 million, or $200 billion, excuse me. And now the estimate's about $677 billion to clean this thing up. And we're a long way from getting there. And I wouldn't be surprised if, 5 to 10 years down the road, we're going to be looking at over $1 trillion. And just to talk about nuclear waste just for a second, what's in these tanks. Not every tank, every tank's a little different. They have different stuff in them, but they're all highly radioactive. There are 2/3 of the high level radioactive waste in the US is out there in Hanford. So it's a huge problem, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it, which we can also talk about. But it's very profitable. Bechtel is the main contractor out there. And they are, there's some very good scientists and engineers that work out there, but it's a for-profit industry, and they get paid to meet deadlines and meet goals, even if the projects and the things that they're working on don't end up actually fixing the problem. And there's very little oversight. The Department of Energy oversees the project, and they're very understaffed. So it's a big problem, and I hope that this book sheds a little light on that.
Well, I think it does. I mean, there's over 250 pages that digs into it, and it's also presented with its full details. There was another. So I was familiar with this topic because there's a section on the whistleblowers, which I want to get to, and Hanford Challenge, and all these really courageous people that have stood up to the disaster economy, essentially, and all of its profit motives, to demand that safety actually be put first and foremost, that the environment actually be treated much more better and less with less indifference and callousness. But this was a section of a book on whistleblowers by Tom Mueller, who wrote this really massive book. There's a history of whistleblowing in the United States. So I was really glad that you gave this a fuller treatment, because when I got done with that section of Tom Mueller's book, I kept thinking, I just want more about this. This is a nightmare of what is going on in this region that we don't hear. And even if there are, like you say right now, leaks going on in the state or around the site, those are not being reported. We're not getting updates on it in the way that we might in a disaster. Like vividly,
Yeah.
people might remember, or probably I don't have to remind people. Like let's take like the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster with BP. Like it's constantly gushing out, and everyone's following it until it could be stopped. But we
Right.
don't really have that with the Hanford nuclear site. It's not like you have people reporting on it as if it's a disaster, and if you don't stop it now, uh, there's going to be a devastation that can't be turned back.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, yeah, thinking about the BP, the oil spill, and we had that that 24-hour a day live stream of it just gushing out like Old Faithful. We don't have that out at Hanford, and also it's just a very complicated mess out there. I mean, you look at um, these tanks, and you've had even the scientists don't even know exactly how much is leaking out every day from these two that are leaking, and they really don't have an answer for what to do with it. And just to give people an idea of what, some of the waste that's in there, so plutonium, there are plutonium, elements in some of these tanks, and the ones that are leaking are, this waste will be with us for way, way past our lifetimes. 250,000 years is the lifespan of plutonium. To put that in perspective, I mean, humans have only been roaming outside of Africa for 60,000 years or so. So it's going to be a long, long time before this stuff is no longer dangerous. And right now, it's seeping towards groundwater supplies. Those groundwater supplies then make its way to the Columbia River. And these tanks are only 5 to 7 miles from the Columbia River. So over time, it makes it into these groundwater supplies. There's no stopping it, and it's going to be lasting for a very long time. One of the answers that they have right now is to just cover this stuff with tarps, so that when it rains, the waste isn't pushed further down into the groundwater supply. I mean, it's kind of comical in the sense, because it's like unbelievable. But also it's very worrisome, because and these guys are worried about it as well, the people that are out there working on this, because they don't necessarily have an answer for it, a quick answer, that is. The goal is to get all of this gunk out of there. They've removed a lot of the liquid waste. So what's happening now is like it's like this sediment, this cake has gone to the bottom of these tanks, and is seeping out. Their goal is to get all of this waste out of there and vitrify it, turn it into glass. So they're building this huge, it's called a VIT plant, a vitrification plant. And it's going to cost about $20 billion to build this thing. To operate it's going to be somewhere around $50 billion. And it was supposed to be operating about 10 years ago, and now they don't think it's going to be operating for another 10 years. It's just a complete disaster. So meanwhile, this stuff is still leaking, and it's really, really worrisome. And so another thing that really worries me, and one of the whistleblowers that we can talk about, Dr. Alexander, who worked for the Department of Energy, went on record with me years ago, and I've been in touch with him ever since. He's now retired. He was the first to really talk about some of the potential dangers in these tanks, aside from the leaking. So one of the concerns that he has is that hydrogen buildup can happen in these tanks. And if there's a spark, if there's a fire, you could have a very catastrophic nuclear explosion, which could become a domino effect out there and on all of these tanks. If there's somehow something like that breaks out, you would have a disaster, not only for the region, but I would argue for the entire country, depending on wind patterns. You're in Chicago. You probably remember when the forest fires were happening in the Northwest a couple summers ago, and there was smoke that was blanketing all of the East Coast as well as the Midwest. Now imagine if that was radioactive debris, what would happen? Locally out there, if some kind of catastrophic event was to happen, the Columbia River would be poisoned even further, decimating, the whole agriculture of the region, commercial fisheries. Places like Boise, Idaho, people probably wouldn't want to raise their families there, because you'd have too much nuclear fallout. It's kind of something that it's hard to go there, to think about the worst case scenario. But I think it's important to just give this some attention, because it is a possibility, even if it's a remote one.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gostola. I'd like to take a brief moment to ask you to become a subscriber of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Just go to thedissenter.org. At the top, you'll see a black button that says subscribe. Click on it, and you'll get options. And for $4 a month or $3 if you become an annual subscriber, you can get access to all of our premium episodes as well as any exclusive content that we post. Now, back to the interview. Now, I want to go to your book. You list out some incredible numbers, and I'll just put those up here so everyone can see. As you describe the impact on the water supply and say that over its lifespan, nuclear production discharged 450 billion gallons of radioactive liquids into the soil. I mean, that's not even a figure that the human brain can comprehend, but that's, uh, the estimate there. Today, 200 square miles of aquifer beneath Hanford is contaminated, and 53 million gallons of radioactive and chemically hazardous waste remain stored in 177 leaky underground tanks that were built in the 1970s. And then you go on to add that in addition, Hanford is approximately 25 million cubic feet or 750,000 cubic meters of buried solid waste, spent nuclear fuel, and even leftover plutonium. So that's what you were
Yeah.
describing. That's what you were telling me about. So let's get into some of these stories of individuals. People might be hearing all of this and they're like, isn't anybody doing anything about this? Are there any people who are trying to stop this? We say it's part, you say it's part of the permanent disaster economy, but is there anybody that's trying to stand up against the status quo and change it so this isn't just getting worse and worse and worse, but it's
hmm
somehow brought under control? And are there anybody standing up to these contractors like Bechtel? So why don't we begin with, I'd like to ask you about the story of Ed Bricker, which you detail in your book, who was an energy, I understand, was an energy department contractor for Rockwell, and actually was followed by a black van. How did he come to be followed by a black van that was trying to silence and even, it appears, take him, murder him?
Yeah. Well, Ed Bricker was an early whistleblower during the initial phase of the cleanup of Hanford. So I think it's important to understand too that Hanford was obviously being run as a covert military operation for all of its lifespan, right? So when it started to become, it turned from a plutonium operation to a cleanup operation, a lot of that, it was still in the middle of the Cold War. So a lot of that fear was permeating the culture of Hanford. And there was essentially a private mercenary group that was policing the whole region because the U.S. was still very concerned about a possible attack on that plant, and they were still under the fear of a Soviet sort of invasion or whatever. So Ed Bricker was operating and working in that environment, and a very young guy at that time, and he was really just wanted to run his professional life like he ran his personal life. He was a devout Mormon. He was a rule follower. And so when he saw things happening on the job site that he knew were very dangerous, he went up the proper channels and did the right thing to bring the things that he saw to the attention of his superiors. And they weren't happy about what he was bringing to the table. They saw him as a problem. They went so far, as I write about, to have a mole, his best friend, to track him and steal his mail, do all kinds of nefarious things to him. And they really,
And just to stop you there very quickly,
yeah,
that mole was blackmailed, right? They were trying
that's
to,
right.
they turned that person against Ed Bricker.
Exactly. Yeah. It was like almost a scene out of like a B Hollywood movie. Like it was really ridiculous and crazy what they were doing. And basically, he just kept doing what he was doing. He would move around to different jobs at the site and continue doing the same thing, expose what he thought were really dangerous situations. And they weren't having it. And it got so bad that even, as I was told the story, that he was tasked one day with hiking into this really highly radioactive area to do a kind of a reconnaissance thing. He had a respirator on, full hazmat suit, and his oxygen tank stopped working, and it looked like it had been sabotaged. He was able to race out of this canyon, and I think that all the workers out there would call this area like the one sniff and you're stiff zone, which basically just was their way of saying, like, you don't want to breathe in any of the the vapors or whatever that's emanating out in that area. Later on, Ed has, even to this day, he's really, really sick. I think he has a form of emphysema. He has all kinds of problems breathing and headaches and things like this that he attributes to that event, and then also other events that happened to him while he worked out there. But he thinks, and others think, that it was an attempt on his life, because he was raising pretty unsavory things about what was happening out there in the work environment that was taking place. So that was back in 30 years ago, longer than that now. But a lot of that culture still exists out there. I think there's been a lot more transparency when it comes to workers' rights, and in large part to an organization called Hanford Challenge that was led by Tom Carpenter. He recently retired, but Tom worked on the Ed Bricker case back even before Hanford Challenge, and got some compensation for Ed. And there was an internal federal investigation into how he was being treated and being wrongfully terminated, and all kinds of stuff. Ed's just one example. Of course, there's other ones too. But his is pretty extreme. I mean, the fact that they, were tracking him and his and his family, and had his friend turn against him and then tried to kill him. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. So then during President Barack Obama's administration, you have, as I'll call it, a new chapter with a new set of issues that are being tackled by Bechtel. And
Mhm.
then there's Donald Alexander. So, and you already mentioned him, but he's one of several whistleblowers who come forward and challenge what's unfolding with the site. Can you describe some of those issues that like what makes Donald Alexander a whistleblower?
Sure. Well, Donald Alexander was a very high level DOE scientist. So the fact that he was, coming from the government side and exposing things that were problematic with contractors below him, and then also with the DOE, were pretty startling. I wrote a couple long series pieces for Seattle Weekly, and Donald Alexander was one of the pieces was about Donald Alexander. He explained to me what he thought was really, really bad acting on the part of other DOE people, as well as Bechtel, in particular with one plant, at the vitrification plant, that, without getting too technical, they were building this contraption essentially that would keep this waste cool before it was becoming vitrified. And so these things were going to be encapsulated in these black boxes. And his big concern was that they weren't going to be operable, that something would happen, and you'd have a bad, a hydrogen buildup, like I mentioned, and have some kind of horrible accident. And he believed that the DOE was rushing through plans to get this stuff operational. And his argument was, once you seal these things in, you can't go in and fix it if there's a problem. So he was blowing the whistle about that, because he believed, this was a big, huge waste of money and a potential disaster in the making. And Bechtel, they went ahead and they did build these boxes. They did not weld on the tops of them. And to this day, they're still not operational. And he was right. Another guy who I write about, Dr. Walter Tamasitis, basically on the same issue, was raising big concerns about this part of the vitrification plant that wasn't going to be operable. He was, unlike Donald Alexander, who worked for the Department of Energy and couldn't really be silenced. They did their best to silence Walter Tamasitis because he worked for a subcontractor of Bechtel at this organization or company called URS, and they sent him to a basement off-site to work. They didn't fire him per se, but they took him off the job. He ended up winning a really big settlement. I was one of the first journalists to cover his story, and I write about him extensively in the book. But what he exposed went beyond just what was happening at the VIT plant. He explained this really corrupt culture at Hanford that is still there to this day. That they put profits over safety. They put profits over getting the job done correctly. And I think what's really important. I come from an environmental background. I definitely am critical of nuclear weapons, obviously nuclear power. But these guys are pro-nuclear in so many ways. They're very patriotic. They're Republican. They're and they're raising these concerns. And I think it's really important to listen to what they have to say because they're not they're coming at it from a very honest perspective. And they're really, really worried. And Walter, to this day, is very concerned about what's happening out there. He no longer works there. He was basically forced into retirement. His story is pretty excruciating. But I think there are others that are experiencing what he went through. And I think that it will be, there's going to be more that come forward in the future because this isn't really going anywhere. And a lot of what they were saying was very prescient. I mean, Walter, 10 years ago was saying this plant is not going to work. It's not going to run. It's a huge waste of taxpayer money. And so far he's been right. And I think a lot of people need to know about this because we're footing the bill and this, companies like Bechtel. And just to get into Bechtel for just a moment, I mean, Bechtel has a horrible track record.
Yep.
And it's always been following, U.S. ventures all over the globe back to, I mean, people can remember Iraq. They messed up many of the contracts there, Afghanistan, Syria, Boston. I mean, all over the place. They get these huge contracts and they have a pretty bad track record. They're privately owned, so they're not accountable to shareholders. And they have essentially a revolving door with the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. So it's just another, pay to play kind of politics that play out even at Hanford, and it's kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah. And I've heard you describe in other interviews how, the politicians that are local to the area are, as you might expect in order for this to be the status quo, in the pocket of these industry players, these companies that are getting these Department of Energy contracts. And as you've already said in the interview, there's not a lot of staff at the Energy Department. There's not a lot of power to conduct oversight that the Energy Department has. And that would probably track for most people who are listening to us because you can look at the fossil fuel industry and see how little oversight is conducted in order to manage them. So it probably isn't completely out of the ordinary for anyone in charge of a nuclear waste dump. I think the reason why people might find it shocking is because, what we're describing here is pretty seated in the past. It's seated in the production of the atomic bomb in World War II. So people would think that, okay, well, we've turned a corner. We're not really doing that anymore. So people might take it seriously that they need to protect the areas from any kind of harm. But, there are all kinds of stories in history in which near disasters happened. And there's even been stories that have come out where we could have seen in their story in North Carolina where a bomb was almost dropped over the state of North Carolina, and it was just some kind of fluke that nothing terrible really happened to the state. And so it's not really true that even if you look at the site, that people are taking the risks seriously. And as I think it has to go back to Bechtel, because
Hmm.
what we're talking about here is how this company, this part of the industry, depends on the near crisis, or well, I mean, it is a crisis, but it depends on these massive leaks in order to continue to get these contracts. In other words, in my mind, if they actually solve the problem, they've now removed themselves from being able to get future contracts from the energy department.
Yeah, I mean, Hanford is a gravy train for them. There's no doubt about it. Um, you have, there's 56 million gallons of waste sitting in these tanks. There's 177 of the tanks total. That stuff's not going anywhere, right? So, um, even if they get this VIT plant up and operating and it was working properly, they're still going to be operating this plant for decades. It's going to take a really long time to vitrify all of that material, and it doesn't. There's a lot of problems that could happen. They just started a test run for low level radioactive waste to vitrify it. So they got their vitrifier up and running, and it overheated. It didn't work. Um, so that set them back even further. They were all excited about it. They had to get this thing up and running. It was like over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it overheated. And so they couldn't even do a test run. So I mean, it's unbelievable how long. I mean, it's going to take a really long time. I think one thing that I would like to buffer my criticism about the amount of money being spent out there is, personally, and I think a lot of people would agree, no amount of money is too much to clean this place up. I mean, it needs to get cleaned up, or at least to a state where it's not a danger as much as it is now. But there needs to be transparency and there needs to be accountability. We need to know where the money's being spent. I think that should be a government. Obviously, technically, it's a government-run operation, but that's not who runs the show out there. Bechtel runs the show. The Department of Energy instead should be. This should be as much effort put into this cleanup as they put into the Manhattan Project and creating a nuclear bomb in the first place. I think that they should be bringing in the best minds possible. They should have a complete DOE operation out there and they should be running the show. So, and there should be more accountability. I think taxpayers and the public has a right to know how this money is being spent and how these contracts are structured. You can look at the contracts and they're immensely complicated. Nobody really can understand them. That's a layman. So we need to have this stuff laid out. We need to have annual reports. We need to have congressional hearings. And I think everybody would be fine with spending the amount of money that's being spent if it was going and we knew it was being spent properly.
Yeah. Just to be clear, I'm not making a big government argument at all about Bechtel and their role, but I'm making an argument about how it's clear that they're not serious about
Yeah,
solving the
absolutely.
problem.
Yeah,
And that's would also be true of US wars, when those contractors
yeah.
get those projects to engage in nation building, whether we're talking about Iraq or Afghanistan, we can see that they did
Hmm.
not make honorable contributions, that they did the bare minimum in order to continue receiving renewed contracts. And there's also even been complaints about contractors like Bechtel when it comes to facilitating US military bases,
Yeah,
and the way that they did harm to soldiers who were deployed there by not looking after their safety. And so then the question becomes, who does have the capacity to be brought in there if you can't trust a private corporation like Bechtel to do this
hmm,
because of the profit motive? I'm going to sideline that question. Maybe we come back to it at the end of the show, because that is a critical question. But one thing I
yeah,
wanted to raise here, and ask you to describe more about is to bring in the role of indigenous people here. We
yeah.
spoke about the stolen lands. I don't want to totally foreground that issue, because it is many ways it is the main problem. Because at this in the history of this site, the US government came in and kicked everybody out that was on the land in order to construct this, and in order to build the atomic bomb that eventually was used to um, kill tons and tons of people, to obliterate them.
Hmm.
And so this is the I have a clip queued up here. This is Russell Jim. I don't know. Do you want to introduce Russell Jim for people before I show him speaking?
Sure. I don't know what clip you're going to play, but Russell Jim was an indigenous elder with the Yakima Nation. He was the became a real expert and advocate for his people. He understood the cleanup really, really well. He was went to Congress all the time. He passed away a few years ago now. I had the pleasure of interviewing him a couple of times. Because of him, today his people and indigenous communities have a seat at the table. There's no big decisions can be made out at Hanford without at least their voice being heard, which was completely ignored up before Russell Jim was, around. So his legacy is really important, and he's a very important advocate for the cleanup and for his people.
So this is a clip that I just pulled that's widely available on YouTube from the Atomic Heritage Foundation. He gave this interview to, I think it was several years. It probably was in the mid 2000s. It's a fairly older looking clip,
Hmm.
but he's just describing what the impact was on the Yakima Nation, and what he thinks should be done as far as I suppose he's talking about justice, as far as actually getting to the bottom and reconciling with the impact on the lives of of indigenous people.
And so, as the consistent mass public deception continued on until 1986 that don't worry, everything's fine, there was a forced release of 19,000 reclassified documents. And in those documents showed that there were tremendous releases of radioisotopes to the environment, primarily iodine-131, and some intentionally in what they called the green run, an intentional release to test the people on the people and the environment. And I think as a result of all this, the Yakima people and many others are suffering the consequences health-wise. So your question regarding what does the land mean, it means that our health being affected also as a result of the environment being affected. The health of the Yakima Nation people depend upon the environment, yet through today, and it will be through tomorrow. And so there is a concerted effort now by the Yakima Nation to influence the cleanup of the site. We need to have some scientific studies done, some diligent efforts, and of course the funding to determine what has happened to the health of the Yakima, what may happen to the gene pool of the Yakima in the future. And I think my question of 15 years ago was, when is the time the mutations are going to show up? When are immune deficiencies going to be as a result of some of the effects on the gene pool? The gene damage, the DNA damage, the chromosome damage. I think it's now. There is evidence of a vast amount of cancers and related illnesses now in the Yakima people. And so we have attempted in our work to be of assistance to the Department of Energy and others to influence this cleanup. We have some good ideas. We have a mandate to preserve and protect their land and resources for the future generations.
So that's Russell Jim.
Yeah.
And can you describe the green run that he's talking about, the controlled release? I so far have neglected that aspect of your book, but I know that they wanted to see if, in fact, this material actually did affect communities.
Yeah. So the green run was an intentional release of iodine 131. Um, I can't remember exact amount that they released. It at the time of the release, it was an intentional release. At the time of the release, it wasn't public. They didn't warn anybody, and there's still to this day no definitive information about why they did it. There's a lot of speculation that they were testing it as a potential biological chemical weapon, and see what kind of effect it would have. But when they released it, some wind picked up, and it spread pretty far and wide. And it was, I think, the biggest release of any radioactive material, intentional release that's known to man. And just if people want to know a little bit about, what iodine 131 is, it will bioaccumulate in your thyroid. It causes thyroid cancers. It's obviously a huge problem. The people that were most affected by this were the Yakima and other people that lived in the vicinity, but it spread far and wide because of the wind patterns. So yeah, it's there's a lot of stuff that went on out there, aside from producing plutonium. There was and it became, then after that, it became a nuclear dumping ground, which Russell Jim really made an impact. He stopped, not him personally, but his actions helped to stop Hanford from becoming a nuclear waste dump for other nuclear warheads and other things that were being transported out there. Because he knew that in order to clean this place up, they had to stop dumping there in the first place, right? So, yeah, he was. It's great to listen to him because he's so articulate. It was so soft spoken, but was really a fierce advocate, and I think we can learn a lot from that kind of from that kind of person.
Yeah, and these people, even if they're given a seat at that table, it's unfortunately the case that they're going to always be second to what the executives at Bechtel are telling the government. But it is
Yeah.
good that they get some kind of input. I mean, they're not entirely frozen out. But let me ask you then, so we have heard about some of these health issues that people are surviving. There's one thing I could say that's popular, but I'm gonna resist it and come back to it later, maybe. But let me just focus on the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court, as I understand, very recently ruled against the workers' compensation law that was set up for people at Hanford that were impacted. I believe that they were getting money for whatever had taken place, as far as like they need to pay their medical bills from all of the issues that they've all the complications they have from being employees in a nuclear waste dump. And but the Supreme Court said that essentially they couldn't do this. I don't have the language exactly in
Yeah.
front of me, but the Supreme Court basically said you couldn't do this because it was like pitting people against the federal government and the contractors for the federal government, something to that effect.
Yeah. Fortunately, basically, in a nutshell, what had happened was the legislation came out of the Washington state, and in that language of the legislation, named Bechtel, and in particular. So that was the challenge to the Supreme Court, that no one company should be, isolated and picked on. Um, and
Okay.
that's what the Supreme Court shot down. But to get around that, they rewrote the legislation to say all contractors. And
Okay.
so, in fact, that legislation stands, and unfortunately was a huge victory for worker compensation out there.
Well, that's good news because I thought
Yeah.
that it was just, blown to smithereens and they were going to have to.
That doesn't mean there's not going to be another challenge, but right now it's held up.
All right. Well, thank you for taking your time to speak with us and talk about this book. I mean, it's really, really good. And so I'm going to wave it
Thanks,
in
man.
front of I'm going to wave it in front of the camera like that helps you sell books. It's Atomic Days, the untold story of the most toxic place in America. And again, it's there's so much detail. I mean, we are just barely glossing over it all, which is the point. Like, I would hope that people would end the conversation and go buy this from ideally Haymarket because that's the publisher, but also you could go find it on wherever you buy books, however you choose to. And I mean, you won't be disappointed. But it also is one of those things that should keep you up. I expect it'll keep you up.
without getting too, like we need systemic change, we do, in order for there to be real accountability out there, because Bechtel has a lot of influence in Washington, and you're not going to see the changes that are needed unless the system changes, right? And of course, we could be talking about healthcare, we could be talking about the fossil fuel industry, whatever. But in the case of Hanford, Bechtel has a ton of influence in Washington. And so no matter what the Department of Energy does, they still have to kowtow to, to these contractors. And there's a bundle of money to be made. So there's a lot of, they don't want the scrutiny that would come with, any kind of oversight.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Josh. It was really good speaking with you. And I wish you the best with the rest of your speaking and talking and touring of your book.
Thanks. Appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me on.
Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the interview. And before we go, one last time, I'd like to ask you to become a subscriber of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Go to thedissenter.org, click on the black subscribe button, and then you'll see the option for subscribing to the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. And you can get access to premium episodes as well as our exclusive content by subscribing. Thank you.